So we are living in a pluralist society today. And what that means is we're living in a society in which most people view all religious paths as equally valid and equally leading to the same end. Okay? We value, in America, we value tolerance, we value acceptance, we value diversity. And we no longer believe in absolute truth. Instead, we believe that everything is relative, for the most part. Okay? But truth be told, no one believes everything is relative, because if everything is relative, then even the statement that everything is relative, right? It only applies sometimes, right? So we live in a pluralist society, even though there are no pure pluralists. We can't live that way. And the reason pluralism, I think, is so attractive to us is because it simplifies the world by narrowing down everything to social conditioning. So I want you to think about that for a minute. Okay? Pluralism stems from the belief that everyone is the way they are. Everyone believes what they believe because of the social network they grew up in. And so the argument goes like this. If you lived in Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't be a Christian today. You are a Christian today because you grew up in a Christian church and in a country where Christianity was accepted. Therefore, you cannot say one person's religious beliefs are true and another person's is not true, because if you didn't live where you live now, you would be what they are. Okay? Pluralism is kind of the idea that human behavior is explained exclusively by our social conditioning. Okay? And so that's the argument. Of course, the answer to that argument is, yeah, well, you wouldn't be a pluralist if you didn't grow up in America. Right? And so that does not explain all of human behavior. In his book, The Reason for God, Tim Keller said that people believe what they believe for three reasons and not one reason alone. So pluralism says people believe what they believe purely because of their social upbringing. That explains it all. But Tim Keller says, no, everybody believes what they believe, whatever it is they believe. They believe it for three reasons and not for one reason only. Number one, people believe what they believe for social reasons. Okay? So people believe what they believe in part because they are surrounded by people who either also believe that or at least are amenable to that view of the world. But people also believe what they believe for intellectual reasons as well. In other words, they've thought through a worldview. This particular worldview makes sense to them, and so they have adopted it. And then the third reason people believe what they believe is for personal reasons, right? They have had some personal experience that has confirmed for them what they believe. And Tim Keller says, whatever you believe today, you believe for each of those reasons, not for one only. And so if an atheist ever says, I believe what I believe purely because I have intellectual reasons and I've thought through it, he's lying. He also has personal reasons, and he's also been in a social group in which atheism is accepted. And that's true for all of us. That's true for all of us. So having said that, though, inevitably one of those three reasons for believing what you believe will be harder to get over than others. So let me give you an example. This past summer, I performed 2 funerals in the span of 36 days here in Laconia. And the most troubling thing about that was that the 2 funerals were for the same family. The daughter passed away first, and then the mother passed away 36 days later. And so in my limited contact with that family since last summer, I am seeing that the greatest obstacle to their faith today is not intellectual. They may believe that what the Bible says is true. They may be surrounded by Christians. It's not social. The greatest obstacle to their faith today is personal. How could God take my sister and my mother in such a short period of time? See? There's a personal reason why they're having trouble believing. But then on the other side, the reason, if you're a Christian today, the reason you believe what you believe is in part because you also have personal reasons. God did something in my life that I can't explain any other way. Something personal happened to you that said, this is true. Okay, so each of those three things happens in all of us. And so if you are like my friends who are really wrestling with why God would take 2 family members in such a short period of time, I think the story of Joseph today is going to help you, because the story of Joseph really speaks to the personal reasons why we either do or do not believe. Because Joseph, as Judy read, experienced great injustice, for which some people would say, God let that happen to me. There is no God. Okay? So the story of Joseph, I think, is really going to address the hurdle of faith as seen in the personal things that happen to us. So 4 things we're going to learn today. 4 things from the Joseph story. Here they are. Number 1, we're going to learn about the pain of misplaced gods. We're going to learn about the cruelty of being your own God. We're going to learn about the freedom of surrender to God. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the hope in the coat of God. So I want you to be writing down your thoughts, your questions at the end, like I try to do almost every time. I just have a time of Q&A where you can say, hey, what does this mean? Or you said this, but... So write down your thoughts, write down your questions. We're going to talk about these 4 things today. So let's begin by talking about the pain of misplaced gods. Nancy Percy wrote a book called Total Truth. And in that book, she said this. I think it's pretty interesting. She said, in this sense, we could say that every alternative to Christianity is a religion. It may not involve ritual or worship services, yet it identifies some principle or force in creation as the self-existent cause of everything else. She said, even non-believers hold to some ultimate ground of existence which functions as an idol or false god. She says, faith is a universal human function, and if it is not directed toward God, it will be directed toward something else. So Nancy Percy basically says, everybody worships. We either worship God or we worship something God has created, but there's no such thing as not worshiping. And what the Bible says is that when we make something or anything other than God the center of our lives, we bring destruction on ourselves, on other people, and on the physical world around us. And so the story of Joseph begins with 3 characters who each are guilty of misplaced gods. We have Joseph, we have Jacob, and then we have Joseph's brothers who are kind of grouped as one. Okay? And so each of these characters has placed something at the center of their lives, but that something is not God, and it's bringing destruction into the family. So let's start with Joseph. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 37, verses 2 through 4. Here's what it says again. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So Joseph was the favorite son of his father. Joseph was the son who got the special coat and the special treatment by dad. Okay, and so as the favorite, if you've ever been the favorite, or if you had a favorite in the family and you weren't the favorite, you know that the favorite can do no wrong, right? The favorite child in the family is the privileged child. The favorite child gets to do things the other siblings don't get to do. And so we kind of see this in verse 12, where Joseph's brothers are out working and Joseph's home hanging out with dad. Okay? Now, it's not Joseph's fault, of course, that he's the favored one, but I want you to see that Joseph takes advantage of his privileged position. Joseph was not completely an innocent victim in his circumstances. Joseph, he didn't deserve to be thrown into a pit, but he also didn't deserve respect from his brothers. And I think you'll see this as we continue. Joseph was a young 17-year-old who, in verse 3, brings a bad report to his father about his brothers. Now, listen, every sibling needs to be ratted out sometimes, right? But I think the reason the author mentions that Joseph brought a bad report is not to say something about his brothers, that, his brothers are always up to something mischievous. I think that the author wrote that so that we would consider something about Joseph. Okay, Because Joseph was the favored one, I believe Joseph knew that whatever he told his father would believe. Okay? And it's not as if Joseph's brothers never brought a bad report about him. But whenever they did bring a bad report about him, they likely were not believed. No, my Joseph, he would never do that, would you, Joseph? Right? He's the favored one. He can do no wrong. Joseph brings a bad report to his father about his brothers, but we're not even told that the bad report was true. In fact, the fact that his brothers hated him so much was probably in part because not every bad report Joseph brought was a true report. Okay? And so when Joseph is sent to Shechem to check on his brothers, the brothers were probably thinking, oh, here comes Joseph to find something bad to go tell Dad about, and we aren't even doing anything wrong. Okay? He's the favored one. Everything he says is believed, and he can do no wrong. Joseph knows he is the favored one, and I believe Joseph takes advantage of it. Here's why. The hatred that his brothers have for him cannot be explained just from their father's favoritism. Just because a child is favored does not mean that child is hated. The favored child is only hated if the favored child takes advantage of his favor, right? Daddy loves me more than you. Okay? And so we see a hint of this attitude, I think, in verses 5 through 11. It says, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. Now, picture your younger brother telling this to you. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves, guess what, guys? They bowed to me. His brothers said to him, really, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And so as if Joseph needed something more to feel good about, God gives, to feel good about himself about, God gives him two dreams. Okay? Now, if Joseph were as pure-hearted as he was in his later years, if Joseph were as pure-hearted in this scene as he was in his later years, Joseph would have taken these dreams and he would have stored them away. Because he would have known how his brothers would have reacted. But let's say that we give Joseph the benefit of the doubt that, okay, maybe he was just excited that he got a dream and just wanted to tell somebody. Well, based on the first reaction, the only reason you tell him a second dream, when they got so angry at the first dream, is if you're trying to rub it in. Joseph tells his brothers the first dream and they get angry. The only reason to tell them the second dream after they reacted so angrily to the first one is either because Joseph was on the high end of the autism spectrum where he doesn't know how his behavior affects others, or he does know and he doesn't care. Joseph, I believe, had begun to worship his own success, and the destruction it was bringing in the family was clear. Joseph knew that he was the favored one, and he knew his brothers hated it. Joseph was fixed on his future success, and he wanted everyone to know about it. Joseph was caught up in his own greatness and future prosperity. He knew his future was destined to be different than his brothers. Joseph was stepping on people to climb his own success ladder, and if you've ever known a person like this, you know that they think too highly of themselves and too lowly of others. A person like this says to themselves, I've gotten where I've gotten because I'm good. And I am where I am because I've earned it. I deserve it. Okay? And it's clear when we read further into the story that Joseph was very talented. It's not as if he feels good about himself without reason. His brothers probably recognize he's more handsome than we are. He's more educated than we are because Dad spent more time with him. He's also more talented than we are. Okay? But Joseph, this is very important, I think, for all of us, especially our young people. Joseph did not consider why he was different. He just relished in the fact that he was. Joseph did not ask God why he made him more talented. He just knew that he was more talented. And so his talents, as a result, went to his head, and he said to himself, I am different because I'm special. And when I get to the top, my brothers will see just how special I am, and they will finally bow to me and stop treating me so badly. Joseph worshipped the God of his own success, and it was making him calloused and self-righteous and bringing destruction into the family. All right, so let's consider Jacob. Joseph has chosen as the center of his identity his own success. Jacob, on the other hand, worshipped his children. And we see this, I think, many times in our society today. Jacob gained his sense of worth and meaning from how well his children were doing. Jacob believed that a person's worth and value was derived from how successful and prosperous and well-adjusted his children became. Jacob believed that the highest thing in life was to be the world's greatest dad, and the worst thing in life was to lose a child or to be rejected by a child. Okay? People like Jacob appear to really love their children, but because they have made their children number one, things eventually fall apart. And let me give you a few examples of how they fall apart. First of all, when we make our children the most important thing in our lives, our children grow up believing that they were brought into this world to be served and not to serve. When a child is the center of a parent's world, the child unconsciously says to themselves, I arrived into this world, and you people were waiting to serve me. And you people changed everything in your life for me. I like this. In fact, I think all of life should be like this. Everybody should just kind of adjust to my presence, right? Now, that's not an audible thought, but, I mean, this is kind of the perspective. So, when a child is the center of the parent's world, the children grow up thinking that life is about being served, not serving. Secondly, when we make children the most important thing in life, we burden our children with huge emotional baggage. Let me give you an example. I did some counseling a while back with a 10-year-old girl. And when you counsel with a 10-year-old, it's always a teamwork between the child and the parent. And so over time, I spent a good amount of time just getting to know the mother. And so in one session, I was just with the mom, talking to her about how things were going with their daughter. And the daughter was in the waiting room. I asked her, I said, so how did you guys go about deciding to adopt? They had adopted their daughter. And she said that they had tried to get pregnant for 17 years, but couldn't. And so I asked her, I said, so what were those 17 years like for you? And her exact words to me were, it was a living hell. Okay. And she said, all I ever wanted to be was a mother, and the fact that I could not be a mother took away my desire to live at times. And so I asked her what it was like to finally adopt their daughter and bring her home for the first time, and she said it was like heaven for a while. Over time, we came to discover, however, that because being a mother was what gave this woman meaning in her life, it's what she worshipped. Over time, the daughter began to bear the heavy weight of being her mother's reason for living. This mother worshipped her child, and as a result, her daughter was showing with various dysfunctional behaviors both at home and at school, and that's why she was in counseling. So when we make our children the center of our lives, we put on our children a huge emotional burden. And then thirdly, when we make children the most important thing in our lives, we will inevitably identify one child who brings us the most happiness and direct most of our attention to them. And this is what happened with Jacob. And so sometimes what happens too is parents choose different children. Dad has his favorite and mom has hers. And what this does to the other children in the home is it makes them bitter at their siblings and resentful toward their parents. Jacob was looking for his own meaning in life from his children and from one child in particular. And we see this most clearly in Jacob's reaction to the news that Joseph was dead. In verse 34, it says, Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters, all his other sons and daughters, came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. Jacob was so devastated by Joseph's apparent death that Jacob no longer had reason to live. All of Jacob's meaning in life evaporated on that day because he learned, because Joseph was his God and not God. Now, parents, let me just say this to us. Our children were born into our lives. We were not born into theirs. Is that right? And so what God wants us to do with our children is he wants us to welcome them into the world and let them know they have a place in our family and that they are loved. But our children must also discover relatively quickly that they were born into our lives not to become the center of our lives, but to walk with us around the center of life, which is Jesus Christ. Okay. Jacob worshipped his children, and one child in particular, and it was bringing resentment and destruction into the family. And lastly, let's consider the brothers. And the other points won't be this long. Okay? Let's consider the brothers. Joseph worshipped the God of success, his own success. Jacob worshipped his children. The brothers worshipped their father. The brothers grew up in a home in which love had to be won. They grew up in a home in which love was given based on abilities and performance and appearance, and Joseph had all those. Okay? And whenever children have to work in order to be loved, the result will be an incessant run after their parents' love. Children who must work in order to be loved spend their adult lives trying to gain the love of their parents, trying to make them proud, trying to get them to finally say, I love you. Okay? And I can't help but think that when Joseph's brothers brought back the coat that they dipped in the goat's blood, and they saw their father Jacob weep inconsolably, I can't help but think that they said to themselves, Dad probably wouldn't even cry if we died. In a home in which love is earned, the favored child grows prideful, and the unfavored children feel unloved and resentful of the one who is loved. The first thing we see, I think, in this Joseph story is the pain that is brought into family because of misplaced gods. And the second thing we see is the cruelty of being your own God. Okay? Whenever we worship something that is not God, it destroys ourselves, it destroys others, and it destroys God's physical world around us. But when we make ourselves God, instead of worshiping something as God, we make ourselves God, something even darker begins to happen. And so it says in verse 18, so Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they said to him in the distance, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. And then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. I want you to think about this. Okay? Because of the pride of Joseph in his youth, and the favoritism of Jacob, and the jealousy that resulted because the brothers could not win the affections of their father, a dark seed was growing in the family, and it was the dark seed of revenge. And revenge says this. Revenge says, I am the judge. I am God. I will right all wrongs. I will make people pay for what they have done. I will teach those evil people the lessons they need to learn. Revenge says, I am God. Revenge says, I've stopped making something else my God, and I've decided to become God myself, and therefore I have the right to judge. I have the right to right all wrongs. Vengeance is perhaps the most blatant hijacking of the God role mankind can take. And the reason I think God says, vengeance is mine, declares the Lord, I will repay, is because God is the only one who knows what it is everyone else deserves. You and I don't know what someone else deserves. You may have planned in your mind 100 times what you might do to someone if you saw them again, but you don't know what that person deserves. That person may have hurt you bad, but you don't know how badly they were hurt. You don't know. Therefore, you are not an unbiased judge. Vengeance in our hearts is the most blatant way to try to be God, and vengeance will make us cruel because we do not know what others deserve. We don't. And so God knows that the quickest way for us to become like Satan is for us to try to be God. And so we see in this passage the pain of misplaced gods. We see the cruelty of being your own God. And then thirdly, we see the freedom in surrender to God. So Joseph was sold into slavery. And even spent, if we were to read the rest of the story, he spent many of the next 20 years in prison for something he did not do. And so what you would expect to see happen in this story is you would expect Joseph to begin to plan in his heart how he was going to get out of slavery, run back home, and just whoop up on his brothers. That's what you'd expect to see. And so I think this is where us modern people get angry when we read this story. We say to ourselves, we see that Joseph has suffered cruel injustice, and we cannot understand any reason why God would allow this to happen. We say, why couldn't God just come down as an angel or something and round up all the boys and say, now boys, we need to play nice or not play at all, right? I mean, wouldn't that have solved it if God appeared? Well, why doesn't God do that? That's a good question. I think I've thought something like that before. Like, God, why don't you just come down and tell them to knock it off? They would. Here's why, I think. Why doesn't God work that way? Because no one ever gave up their right to be God by being told to do so. No one ever gave up their right to be God by being told to do so. The only way for God to convince you that you need Him is to let you experience just how hateful the God you serve is. God knows that whatever we choose to worship in this life, if it's not Him, it will hate us and destroy us and make our lives a living hell. Those who worship money will be destroyed by money. Those who worship success will be destroyed by success. Those who worship beauty will always feel ugly. Those who worship power will always feel weak. Those who worship sex will never be satisfied with sex. Those who worship their children will break their children. Those who worship a lover will push that lover away. And those who worship themselves will never feel good enough. If all Joseph needed saving from was his brothers, I believe God would have intervened because he's done it before in other people's lives. But that's not all Joseph needed saving from. Joseph needed saving from the God of success because it was destroying him and his family. And I believe that somewhere on the road between Dothan and Egypt, as he's walking, perhaps handcuffed, down to Egypt, somewhere on that road, Joseph became aware of just how hateful the God of success was, and he surrendered it over. And so the reason I believe this is the point where Joseph changes is because the very next time we see Joseph, he is Potiphar's servant. And so here's what it says in chapter 39, verse 2. It says, the Lord was with Joseph, and Joseph became a successful man. The Lord caused all that Joseph did to succeed in his hands. So consider this. When Joseph gave up the God of success, God began to make him successful. Okay. When Joseph gave up the God of success, he became a free slave. Joseph was free of the need to make something of his life, and he could just serve wherever God put him. And wherever God put him, Joseph served with all of his heart. The God of success was gone. He no longer had the plans for what his life would be like. He was surrendered. And I think that surrendering happened between Dothan and Egypt in a long walk in the desert, handcuffed, surrendering to God. God, I've made success my God, and it's destroyed my family. Have your way with me. So we see in this story the pain of misplaced gods. It destroys everything. We see the cruelty of being your own God, vengeance. Thirdly, we see the freedom in surrender to God. When Joseph gave up the right to be his own God, there was freedom, and he could serve. And then lastly, I'm going to close with this. We see the hope in the coat of God. We see the hope in the coat of God. So the Joseph story tells us about a God who takes the pain produced by misplaced gods and weaves it into his salvation story. The cruel injustice done to Joseph becomes God's means to save the rest of the world from famine. If you were to read the rest, okay? The God of the Bible does not cause evil, but the God of the Bible is so wise and so powerful that he's able to remake evil for good. And so what we see in Joseph's story is a glimmer of Jesus. Joseph was a man who involuntarily was thrown into the pit to die. Jesus was a man who voluntarily lowered himself into our pit that we might live. Joseph tauntingly gave up his own. Joseph tauntingly came to his own, and his own sold him. Jesus lovingly came to his own, and his own killed him. Joseph was sold for money for being a jerk. Jesus was sold for money for loving us jerks. Joseph cried out in the pit, and his brothers eventually helped him. Jesus cried out in the garden, but his friends totally deserted him. In the pit, Joseph lost his coat. But on the cross, Jesus lost his Father's love. Joseph did not make his brothers pay for the wrong they did. And because of Jesus, God will not make us pay for the wrong we've done either. Joseph received a coat of many colors because his father loved him. Jesus gave up his coat of many colors so that God could love us. Folks, if you're struggling today with how to understand the bad things that happen in this world, if that's a barrier to faith for you, let me encourage you with this. Just like Joseph, we do not see what God is doing or planning behind the scenes of evil. But this we can know. God cares about the bad things that happen to you. God did not cause them, but God can weave them into his plan. But here's what you really need to know. Every world religion tells us that we will suffer if we do not pay. If you do not live right, if you do not perform these rituals, if you do not live this life well, you will be punished in the next life, or you have to be reincarnated in a lower form. Every religion tells us basically that if you don't do this, this is coming. Only Christianity tells us. Every world religion tells us that we will suffer if we do not pay. Only Christianity tells us that God came to pay so that we don't have to suffer. Though this world is dark, and many pits may befall you, yet if you have on your shoulders the coat of God's love, which Jesus gave up for you, God will weave your pain into his larger salvation story. The story of Joseph is, at its highest, a picture of the coat of love given to us because Jesus on the cross gave up his coat for us. We are clothed with many colors, all the colors of the rainbow. God has wrapped us up in his unfailing love. This, I believe, is the highest truth found in the Jesus story.